Hi class, it's Jamie Batts, your instructor. We're going to dive into chapter 16, just moving our way on through this textbook. Let's find, why are they never up anymore? Let me see if I can find them in here. Sorry, this should have been ready to go, but it wasn't. There we go. That's not it. This should be it. Okay, don't know what's going on there. All right, so we're going through the endocrine system, which is our final body system of this semester, and it just so happens to be pretty darn complex. There's a lot of chemistry involved, a lot of organs involved, so let's begin with a comparison between the nervous system and the endocrine system, because something that you're going to find, especially in A&P2, is every organ system has three methods of communication. Now, this is like a big picture thing that you're going to have to keep in the back of your head. All systems have three forms of regulation and communication. They're all regulated at a local level with either local hormones or local cell-to-cell signals. It's called autoregulation generally, and it's just using little cell messengers. All systems are also regulated at a nervous system level with the central nervous system, those autonomic reflexes, and all of those things we've been talking about pretty much all semester. Everything is also having some type of endocrine regulation as well. The endocrine system has several target tissues all throughout the body in which it is sending special hormones to, special cell signals to in order to regulate. So autoregulation, neural regulation, and endocrine regulation are the three ways everything in our body is controlled, and it's a balance of those three mechanisms that makes us maintain homeostasis. So let's begin with a comparison between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Overall similarities, they both use chemicals, right? Our neurotransmitters are what we use in the nervous system. Our hormones are what we use in the endocrine system. They're both primarily regulated through negative feedback, and overall the goal is to maintain homeostasis. Here you see what goes on in all of our direct cell communication. Remember I said that autoregulation, so they can be direct communicated. There's also something called paracrine communication. This is when cells are sending signals through the extracellular fluid. Endocrine communication uses the bloodstream. So this is where little hormones or cell messengers are going out into the blood, and then they're going to some type of target tissue, and then synaptic communication, which is involving our neurons. You can pause the video here, go back and review these three questions. Let's start with a basic review of some chemicals in our endocrine system. First of all, I don't think I've ever heard my phone make that sound before. Anyways, first of all, our hormones can be amino acid derivatives, meaning they are derived or made directly from amino acids that we bring in through our diet or that are modified by our liver. These are our thyroid hormones, which are obviously produced by our thyroid gland, catecholamines, which are the epinephrine, norepinephrine, and dopamine, and melatonin. Melatonin is a derivative of tryptophan, and that is secreted by the pineal gland. Our hormones can also be peptide-based hormones. These are larger than the amino acid derivatives. These include the majority of the hormones in our body. They're synthesized as something called a prohormone, and then they become active after they've entered the blood or after they've gone through some type of modification. So they range from very small polypeptide chains to very small proteins, which, again, proteins are pretty large molecules. So these are things like thyroid stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, TSH, FSH, and LH. There's also lipid derivatives. These lipid derivatives are made of carbon rings, but they also have side chains of fatty acids, either eicosanoids or cholesterol, which is the steroid molecules. Eicosanoids are a paracrine factor. These are coordinating cellular activities, enzymatic processes in the extracellular fluids. These are like leukotrienes, which have a secondary role as hormones. They're also prostaglandins, which involve coordinating local cellular activities. Those are kind of those little cell-to-cell messengers. Also, lipid derivatives could be our steroid hormones. These are released typically by our reproductive organs, the adrenal cortex, and the kidneys. From the reproductive organs, we have the androgens, which are being secreted by the testes. That's the testosterone, and estrogen and progesterone by the ovaries. The corticosteroids, which are coming from the adrenal cortex, and the kidneys are releasing calcitriol to regulate vitamin D and calcium reabsorption in the intestines. Typically, these steroid hormones are bound to transport proteins because they're lipid soluble. They're not going to dissolve in the blood, so they have to be bound to some type of peptide, some type of protein that's going to be able to transport them, kind of like a little boat that they can float around on in the blood, because otherwise they're not going to dissolve. So here you see those amino acid derivatives, the lipid hormones, listed for you. Let's also go into an overview of our endocrine system. There are several specific endocrine organs like the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the hypothalamus gland, but there's also several organs in our body that have a non-endocrine function, and therefore they have an endocrine function that's kind of like a secondary job. So our heart and our kidneys, our intestines, they all have another role other than an endocrine function, but they also have a role with hormones. They also secrete hormones for some type of feedback loop. So let's talk about the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is secreting the majority of hormones that are involved in fluid balance, smooth muscle contraction, hormone secretion by the anterior pituitary. It's actually linked, if you recall, central nervous system anatomy, it's linked directly to the pituitary gland and therefore has direct control over the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland itself secretes hormones like stimulating melanin production, multiple hormones that are involved in regulating overall endocrine activities throughout the body, like the adrenal cortex, the thyroid gland, and all of our reproductive organs. That thyroid gland secretes hormones that are going to affect our metabolic rate as well as calcium ions in our blood. The adrenal glands contain a cortex and a medulla. The cells of the cortex are where the hormones are coming from. These are the hormones that are involved in things like mineral balance, like calcium, sodium, potassium balance, also metabolic control and resistance to stress. The medulla is going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine, and that's in response to sympathetic activation. The pancreas has, remember, that an exocrine and an endocrine function. The exocrine function is as it works as a digestive organ secreting enzymes and buffers for the digestive process, but it also has an endocrine role. The islet cells within the pancreas secrete insulin and glucagon to regulate blood glucose levels. The pineal gland on the back of the diencephalon secretes melatonin, which affects our circadian rhythms, our day-night cycles, and the parathyroid glands are an important regulator of blood calcium ion levels. Other organs like the heart secrete hormones to regulate blood volume. The thymus secrete hormones in response to the immune system. The digestive tract has a little digestive hormone feedback loop controlling glucose metabolism and appetite and overall digestive functions and control. The kidneys have hormones that are going to increase or decrease blood cell production as well as control the rate of calcium reabsorption and phosphate reabsorption in the digestive tract. And the gonads, the testes and ovaries, have hormones that are going to help regulate growth and metabolism as well as the organs of our reproductive system. So there you see all of the players of our endocrine system. Let's pause for a second so you can review these 3 questions, and we're going to talk about how hormones work. So hormones are basically going out into the blood. As we've said, they travel in the blood and they're going to bind to special receptors. So these receptors are only on what's called the target tissue. So it's, again, kind of this, every house has a lock, but there's only, one key to your house. It's kind of the same idea. There's all of these hormones floating around the blood, but they can only bind to one particular target tissue or a myriad of target tissues. But those target tissues all have the same lock, right? They all have the same receptor that is needed to receive this particular hormone. So a tissue can be non-responsive to a hormone if the receptor is not working properly. Cells have receptors for different types of hormones for different reasons. Different combinations of receptors are going to produce differential effects on various tissues throughout the body. So just because one hormone is targeting one particular area doesn't mean another hormone can come in and not target that same area. Multiple hormones can have different effects on that same target tissue or target organ. There's two receptor locations on the target cells. Typically, they're on the plasma membrane. That's one location. These would be water-soluble hormones that can't cross the plasma membrane, and so they use something called a first messenger and a second messenger. They bind to the receptor on the outside of the cell. That's going to act as a first messenger, and then the second messenger is going to catalyze some type of chemical reaction inside the cell, which usually involves something called a G protein. The G protein is just a little enzyme complex, and that G protein gets the cascade reaction going inside the cell so that the cell can do whatever it's supposed to do in response to that particular hormone. The other example, or a continuation of that, so that G protein is activated, and typically what it does is it's going to involve something called cyclic AMP or CAMP, and this is going to either have an inhibitory effect on the cell or an excitatory effect on the cell. Calcium ions can also play a role here. They generally will function to activate enzymes, involve something called calmodulin inside of the cell. So here you see what I'm talking about with these extracellular hormone receptors. The hormone comes in, binds to the protein receptor. This G protein is now activated. And once that G protein is activated, cyclic AMP can activate enzymes and open ion channels, or it can reduce enzyme activity. So it has differing effects, again, depending on the cell. Or calcium, what it can do is it can activate that G protein, and the G protein then activates the calcium ion channels, and the calcium ion channels can then open. Calcium can flood into the cell, or play its role inside the cell, whatever it's supposed to do, changing the overall ion concentration, etc. So this video is on masteringamp.com. You can check it out, and it has a detailed mechanism of how this secondary messenger works. If you don't have access to masteringamp.com, you can just do a quick Google search for mechanism of hormone action using secondary messenger. There's tons out there, especially on YouTube. The other way that hormones can bind is within the cytoplasm or within the nucleus. Steroid hormones do this because steroid hormones cannot bind to the outside of the cell because they're not soluble in water. They have to be carried by that protein. They're going to diffuse through the plasma membrane, and they're actually going to have an effect on specific genes. They're going to affect the DNA transcription rate of particular genes and the creation of particular proteins through protein synthesis. So it's going to change the synthesis rate of an enzyme or structural proteins, and that's overall going to have an effect on the cell's metabolic level. The activity of the cell, like testosterone, is going to cause increased structural proteins within the muscle fibers, therefore increasing muscle mass and muscle size. Right, so here's how a steroid hormone works. Steroid hormone comes in through this plasma membrane, binds to a receptor. The receptor and the hormone go into the nucleus. They're going to bind to some type of specialized area on the DNA, and that's going to activate the gene, and therefore more of these proteins are going to be made, and the target cell will then release those proteins to wherever they need to be. So there's also thyroid hormones other than steroid hormones acting in this way. Thyroid hormones go through the cell membrane, and they bind to receptors on the mitochondria, not within the nucleus. Now they're going to the mitochondria. And this is going to play a role in ATP production, overall metabolism. This is why thyroid hormones have such a huge role in our metabolism. They're literally affecting the mitochondria of our cell. So they bind to receptors in the nucleus as well, activating and changing the metabolic activity of the cell. But the big difference between a steroid hormone and a thyroid hormone is the fact that the thyroid hormones are affecting your mitochondria directly. So that's the overall process. Same thing. We're just taking a little stop off at the mitochondria as well. So you can pause the video here, go back and review this section. Let's talk about some of these endocrine organs specifically, and we'll start with the hypothalamus. I like to call the hypothalamus the master gland, even though most textbooks will call the pituitary the master gland. The hypothalamus has the highest level of regulation for the endocrine system. It has a couple different levels of control. Basically, the biggest one is that these hypothalamic neurons are creating hormones that are then transported and released into the anterior or the posterior pituitary, and they're released through the posterior pituitary. So in other words, the posterior pituitary is just acting as a medium to release those hypothalamic hormones, ADH and oxytocin. ADH is, well, we'll get into the hormone function a little bit, but this is regulating overall blood volume. Oxytocin is regulating myriad of basically female reproductive functions. We'll get into that, all of that. The hypothalamus also secretes regulatory hormones. This is major. These regulatory hormones control the anterior pituitary. So not only did the hypothalamus take over the posterior pituitary by saying, hey, you're going to release these hormones for me, but the hypothalamus is also telling the anterior pituitary what it can and cannot make. And it does this through regulatory hormones. We'll talk about those in a little bit. It also contains autonomic centers that directly stimulate the endocrine cells within the adrenal medulla. So they're stimulated in response to sympathetic division activation, and in response, the adrenal medulla are going to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream and cause overall sympathetic activation all over the body. So here you can see what's going on. These hypothalamic neurons communicating with that posterior pituitary, telling them when to release ADH and oxytocin. Anterior pituitary is regulated by these special hormones that come down, and we'll see there's a little specialized blood circuit that's going through this pituitary gland carrying those regulatory hormones. And then the autonomic centers within the hypothalamus directly regulating the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal glands. So let's talk about this thing called the hypophyseal portal system. This is that capillary network that connects the hypothalamus with the anterior pituitary. It's sending regulatory hormones through the infundibulum into special fenestrated capillaries within the anterior pituitary. And so it forms this little capillary network, and it allows these hypothalamic hormones to reach the target cells very quickly without having to mix and dilute the general circulation of the rest of the blood. So here you see what I mean. There's the hypophyseal artery bringing blood in, mixes up here in the hypothalamus, picking up those hormones, picking up those regulatory hormones, and it's going to carry those regulatory hormones directly down here to our veins of our anterior pituitary, and that's going to have a direct connection with all of these cells, which are making and secreting series of hormones, and those hormones will be released in response to the regulatory hormones coming down from the hypothalamus, and then those hormones will then go into the blood and circulate throughout the body. So let's talk about these regulatory hormones. There's releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Releasing hormones do just that. They stimulate the anterior pituitary to release hormones. The inhibiting hormones are going to inhibit the anterior pituitary from releasing hormones. So you can pause the video here, go back and review these 3 questions. Let's talk about this pituitary gland in more detail. It's also called the hypophysis. It's a little small oval gland, lies within that stella turcica of the sphenoid bone, if you remember back to our bone anatomy. It secretes 9 peptide hormones. So there's 7 from the anterior pituitary or adenohypophysis. These are called tropic hormones because they're basically turning on other endocrine organs. And then there's 2 hormones that are released from the neurohypophysis or the posterior pituitary. All 9 of these hormones bind to the membrane receptors, and they use cyclic AMP. So they use that G protein cyclic AMP pathway that we mentioned before. Here you see the overall anatomy: anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary, and hypothalamus, infundibulum. Anterior pituitary is also called the adenohypophysis. Posterior pituitary is also called the neurohypophysis. In lab, you'll get to see that these 2 structures are made of very different tissue, and you can kind of see it here. This kind of whitish tan tissue is extending down to the neurohypophysis, because the neurohypophysis is highly neural in structure. It looks like a bunch of axons and neurons gathered together, whereas the adenohypophysis really looks like gland tissue. It looks like endocrine tissue. So very different from one another. Let's talk about the hormones of the anterior pituitary. You have TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. This is targeting the thyroid gland, so it's going to tell the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. It is released in response to thyrotropin releasing hormone, or TRH. That TRH comes directly from the hypothalamus via the hypophyseal portal system that we mentioned before. It's decreased when thyroid hormone levels rise. It's a process of negative feedback, right? Blood thyroid hormone levels decrease. The hypophyseal portal system releases TSH or TRH into the adenohypophysis. The adenohypophysis says, oh, we need more thyroid stimulating hormone going around, so we'll release some TSH into the blood. TSH goes down to the thyroid. Thyroid secretes thyroid hormone, and as those thyroid hormone levels rise in the blood, thyrotropin releasing hormone is shut off from the hypothalamus, and then TSH is shut off from the pituitary as blood thyroid levels reach a homeostasis, reach where they need to be. So there's also ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. This is also known as corticotropin. This is the hormone that's stimulating the release of steroid hormones from the adrenal cortex. It's specifically those hormones that are in response to glucose metabolism. These are the hormones that affect glucose metabolism. So this is released in response to corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So again, as those levels fall, hypothalamus secretes the releasing hormone, anterior pituitary releases ACTH, blood levels rise, and then the whole thing shuts off in the process of negative feedback. So these steroid hormones are specifically mobilizing glucose reserves and breaking down glucose. This is a huge kind of fight or flight type hormone. Gonadotropins regulate the activity of the gonads. These are released in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. And there's two major gonadotropins. There's FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. Females respond to FSH by promoting ovarian development, the follicle development. So basically maturing the egg, and that's going to stimulate estrogen production as kind of a byproduct. In males, it's producing the maturation of sperm. It is inhibited by something called inhibin. So once those cells are growing, once they're mature enough, inhibin will be released, and then FSH is turned off, and the cycle will kind of stop. The other gonadotropin is LH, luteinizing hormone. In females, this is inducing ovulation. It's inducing that kind of rupturing of the follicle from the ovary into the uterine tubes, promoting the secretion of estrogen and progesterone, basically preparing the body for pregnancy. In males, it's stimulating the release of testosterone, androgen. So it's basically encouraging more testosterone to be released in the testes. Testosterone is going to fuel those special nurse cells to basically nourish the sperm as they grow and develop within the testes, so that the sperm can be nice and healthy to make their big old swim towards the egg cell. Other hormones of the anterior pituitary include the growth hormone, or GH. This is going to stimulate cell growth. Obviously, it's called growth hormone. Also reproduction. It also accelerates the rate of protein synthesis. And it is regulated by growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibiting hormone. The actions of growth hormone can be direct or indirect. Indirect action of growth hormone would be where the liver responds to growth hormone by synthesizing special compounds to stimulate tissue growth, or insulin-like growth factors, IGFs. The receptors for those types of growth factors on various cells throughout the body, like skeletal muscles, cartilage, and the response is increased uptake of amino acids and incorporation into new proteins. So again, just building. Direct actions of growth hormone include epithelial and connective tissues, where they're stimulating stem cell division and differentiation, or adipose tissue that's stimulating the breakdown of triglycerides, or in the liver where it's stimulating the breakdown of glycogen reserves. Prolactin is another hormone from the anterior pituitary. This is going to work with other hormones to stimulate mammary gland development in pregnancy and during the nursing period. It stimulates milk production, and it is released in response to several prolactin-releasing factors, and it's inhibited by prolactin-inhibiting hormone. There's also MSH, melanocyte-stimulating hormone. This is possibly released from a part called the pars intermedia of the anterior lobe. It stimulates melanocytes of the skin to increase melanin production. In adults, this is almost non-functional. MSH is not in circulation in adults. This is kind of the accumulation of pigment that occurs just after birth in infants. Most infants are born with not a lot of pigment in their skin, and then slowly those melanocytes become active and start secreting more and more pigment. Here you see all of the hormones of the anterior lobe of the pituitary. Let's talk about hormones of the posterior lobe. You have ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, also known as vasopressin, or VP. This is released in response to a variety of stimulus, including increased solute concentration, or a decrease in blood pressure, or a decrease in blood volume at the kidneys. Its primary function is to act on the kidneys to retain water and decrease urination by concentrating the kidneys. It causes vasoconstriction, again, which is going to cause an increase in blood pressure. The release is inhibited by alcohol. So when you drink alcohol, ADH is not going to be released, which is one of the reasons why you probably notice you're going to the bathroom more than you usually would. And this is also why you get a hangover, because that water is not being retained, it's being eliminated because ADH is being suppressed. So, oxytocin is the other hormone from the posterior lobe. This is released in response to sensory input. It's actually a neuroendocrine reflex. It's stimulating the smooth muscle contraction of the uterus during labor and delivery. It's also contracting myoepithelial glands within the mammary glands to promote the ejection of milk. So prolactin is making the milk. Oxytocin is getting the milk out of the body, ejecting the milk, which if you've ever nursed, you know that it can shoot pretty far. It certainly is ejected. And it does have functions in sexual activity. It's kind of like our love hormone. It's secreted when you feel bonded and connected to someone else, which is why levels will rise during sexual activity. So those are the hormones of the posterior lobe. You can pause the video here, go back and review this section. We're going to keep moving and shaking and talk about negative feedback. Negative feedback is the typical control mechanism for our hormones. Some examples. Hypothalamic releasing hormone triggers the release of a hormone from the anterior pituitary, which triggers the release of a second hormone by the target gland. That second hormone will then suppress the secretion of both the hypothalamic releasing hormone and the pituitary hormone. I kind of gave examples of this already, but there it is in words that you can read over and over again if what I was saying wasn't making sense. But here it is in a picture. It sometimes makes more sense when you see it in a picture. So from the hypothalamus, you have releasing hormone coming down, triggering our anterior lobe to release the stimulating hormone, hormone 1. That stimulating hormone goes to the endocrine organ. The endocrine organ releases its hormone, hormone 2. Hormone 2 levels rise in the blood. It goes to the target cells. And as that hormone 2 levels rise, it's going to now inhibit or turn off the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. So now this whole pathway is shut down once those levels rise back up to normal. And here you see that this kind of breakdown of what the releasing hormones are, what the first hormone is, the endocrine organ, and the second organ. So TRH is going to stimulate TSH, which is going to stimulate the thyroid gland, which releases thyroid hormones. CRH stimulates ACTH from the pituitary, which goes to the adrenal cortex, which releases glucocorticoids. GnRH is going to stimulate FSH and LH from anterior pituitary, which goes to the testes and ovaries, and they're going to release their sex hormones or inhibin to inhibit the process. So in some cases, both releasing and inhibiting hormones are part of the regulatory process. For example, growth hormone. I can never say this word. Somatomedins are released by the liver. They influence the hypothalamic hormones. They inhibit the release of growth hormone releasing hormone, and they stimulate the release of growth hormone inhibiting hormone. Prolactin. Prolactin inhibits the release of prolactin releasing factor, but it stimulates the release of prolactin inhibiting factor, which makes sense. If prolactin is already present, you don't need more of it to be released, right? You can inhibit it from being released because it's already there. This is the same idea. The somatomedins do the same thing, turning off the cycle. So here is a chart showing you all of those hormones, where they're released from and where their target tissue is, and what the overall hormone, or that hormone 2, should be coming from that endocrine organ. You can pause the video here, go back and review. All right, so we covered the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Let's talk about another big player of our endocrine system, the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is located on the anterior surface of the trachea. You can actually feel it. It's inferior to that Adam's apple or thyroid cartilage that kind of sticks out. You can feel it if you swallow. You lean your neck back a little bit and swallow. It kind of comes up a little bit. It's soft tissue that's in there. It's composed of 2 lobes, looks like a little butterfly. It's connected by an isthmus in the middle, easily felt with your fingers. As I just said, it has a very deep red color because it has a rich blood supply. There you see it on that nice old lady. Histology, it's made of thyroid follicles. These are little hollow spheres surrounded by cuboidal epithelium. The follicular cavity holds a colloid, which has lots of proteins inside of it. The colloid basically secretes a protein called thyroglobulin. That's the molecule that contains tyrosine. Tyrosine is the building block for our thyroid molecule. So it's basically like a holding tank for what will eventually be made into thyroid molecules. Lots of capillaries to get rid of waste products, transport nutrients, etc. There's also C cells, or clear cells. C cells secrete calcitonin. Calcitonin helps to regulate calcium ion concentrations in the blood. Here you see the overall anatomy. There you can see that big colloid. See these little clear cells off to the side, the follicular cells surrounding the follicle. So thyroid hormones are produced in several steps. First, you need iodine ions. Iodine ions come from your diet. A lot of iodine is actually brought in through salt. Salt is typically iodized, especially if you're using just normal table salt. If you're using fancy salt like Himalayan sea salt or something like that for your diet, it's probably not iodized. So you might have to make sure that you're bringing enough iodine into your diet through fish or other supplements. But typically our table salt is iodized for this purpose. Otherwise it produces a goiter. A whole nother story there. So iodine ions come from your diet. They're delivered directly to your thyroid gland, taken up by those follicular cells. The enzymes will convert the iodide ions into iodide atoms, basically by splitting them apart. They will attach themselves to tyrosine portions of the thyroglobulin molecule. This produces something called thyroxine, T4, has 4 iodides, or triiodine, which is T3, which has 3 iodines, and those are stored within those little protein carrier molecules. The follicles are will remove the thyroglobulin from the follicle through a process of endocytosis, and enzymes break that thyroglobulin down by releasing the thyroid hormones and the amino acids directly into the cytoplasm. T4 is a majority of our thyroid secretions. T3 is a very small part. They basically diffuse across the basement membrane of the thyroid and then enter the bloodstream. 75% of T4 and 70% of T3 will travel being attached to a protein, a thyroid binding globulin. And the hormones are basically released by these proteins gradually as they float around the blood. They're not all just like given off all at once. Those proteins hold on to them and make them last. So they can actually survive for a very long time in the blood. Your blood at any given time has about a week's supply of thyroid hormone floating around in it. So even if your thyroid's shut off tomorrow, you would be okay. I start to feel weird after a few days, but here's the whole process. Those iodine ions come in. There's a little pump going in there, diffusion, iodine atoms are created, and then the thyroid globulin molecule is made. Endocytosis brings it back in to the follicular cell from the follicle cavity, and other amino acids come in, they diffuse, they're basically going to be released once they're bound to a globulin. Here's the effects of thyroid hormones on peripheral tissues, just an overall summary. increased rates of oxygen consumption, increased metabolism, increased sensitivity, sympathetic stimulation, kind of puts you on edge, right? Gets that whole heart rate, respiration rate. Oh, what's going to happen? It also stimulates red blood cell formation, stimulates activity in other endocrine tissues, and it accelerates the turnover of minerals in your bones. It can also raise your blood pressure, so it's not necessarily a good thing to have too much thyroid hormone. Let's talk about the parathyroid gland. Parathyroid gland is two pairs of little like beads on the back of the thyroid. There's about 4 of them. They're very, very small. There they are on the back of the thyroid. They contain 2 cell populations, oxyphil cells. Don't really know what they do, but there's also parathyroid cells. Parathyroid cells produce parathyroid hormone, PTH. This increases the calcium level within the extracellular fluids. They also monitor calcium levels in the blood. So when calcium levels fall, PTH is released, increasing calcium levels in the blood. This is our main regulator of calcium in our blood, parathyroid hormone. So in terms of calcium homeostasis, it's really a balance between PTH and calcitonin from the thyroid gland. They have opposing effects, as you should realize at this point. In healthy adults, PTH is that primary regulator. It basically, taking the thyroid gland away has little to no effect on calcium. Dietary intake, metabolic demand, as long as it's balanced, your calcium levels should be fine. It's very, very rare that having a thyroid removed will affect your calcium levels. But when you remove your thyroid, it's important that they keep your parathyroid in there, which can be kind of tricky because they're embedded in your thyroid gland. Calcitonin can actually be administered clinically as well to assist with any metabolic disorders. So here you see the overall calcium homeostasis loop, increasing blood calcium levels. So the thyroid gland is going to release calcitonin. This is going to get rid of calcium at the kidneys, put calcium in our blood, as well as, and it doesn't say it here, but it's going to decrease the absorption of calcium from the digestive tract, getting our blood calcium levels back to normal. Decreasing blood calcium levels, PTH is going to be released. This is going to increase the reabsorption of calcium at the kidneys, take calcium from our bones, and increase the calcitriol production, which is going to increase the reabsorption at the intestines. And that's going to get your homeostasis back to normal, be restored. Let me go the other way. I like how they, I like to put them on individually so that you can summarize, and you can even create the rest of the flow chart on it with that empty slide. Overall effects of parathyroid hormone on peripheral tissue. It's really all about calcium, mobilizing calcium reserves, getting calcium into the blood, and stimulating the formation of calcitriol in the kidneys, again, to affect calcium in our blood. You can pause the video here and go back and review these 3 questions. Adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are also sometimes called the suprarenal glands because they sit on the superior border of each kidney. They're the little kidney hats, as I like to say. They're retroperitoneal, just like the kidneys, so they sit behind the parietal peritoneum. They have a very rich blood supply of which gives them a very intimate relationship with our blood, which is why hormones and neurotransmitters can be released so easily to and from. It's kind of yellowish in color because it has lots of lipids, especially cholesterol, various fatty acids stored inside. Has outer connective tissue covering called a capsule, an outer region called a cortex, which is where our corticosteroid hormones are produced. These are the hormones that affect the metabolism of target cells. They're crucial in maintaining life. And then the adrenal medulla, which is where our epinephrine and norepinephrine come from. So within the adrenal cortex, there are 3 zones, 3 areas. There's the zona glomerulosa. This is the outer region. This secretes mineral corticoids, primarily aldosterone. The job of these mineral corticoids are to increase the renal absorption of sodium and water, especially when ADH is present. And they're also going to accelerate the loss of potassium. You will see more so next semester that sodium and potassium always move opposite of each other. So if it's increasing the absorption of sodium, it's going to increase the secretion of potassium. It's also going to stimulate the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system and inhibit any hormones that are opposing that system. The next layer is called the zona fasciculata. This is the large central portion of the adrenal cortex. This is where the glucocorticoids are created. This is the cortico and the corticosterone. Your liver will convert some of that cortisol into cortisone, and it's also going to basically be stimulated by ACTH, which comes from the anterior pituitary, as we just reviewed. All overall actions of these glucocorticoids, it's all about glucose metabolism, increasing rates of liver glucose and glycogen formation, stimulating the release of amino acids from our skeletal muscles, stimulating lipids from our adipose, promoting lipid metabolism. This is getting stuff churning, getting that ATP made, because we're in fight or flight mode and we need that ATP now because we might have to run for our lives. So cortisol also has an anti-inflammatory effect, which some of you may know if you've ever had a cortisol shot or a cortisone shot, maybe if you had arthritis or knee problems or something. The final layer is the zona reticularis. This forms a narrow band that borders each adrenal medulla, secretes small quantities of androgens. The androgens can be converted into estrogens while they're in the bloodstream. They have minimal effects in normal adults, but they are basically stimulating the onset of puberty in prepubescent children, and also just responsible for some of the minor sexual differences between males and females that are prepubescent. So this is why boys and girls do look slightly different and have different depositions of body fat and stuff like that, even before puberty hits. It's because of these small quantities of androgens that are floating in their blood. These are also stimulated by ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. The adrenal medulla is where epinephrine and norepinephrine are released. The actions of epinephrine, norepinephrine is all sympathetic. Increased cardiac, increased blood pressure, increased glycogen breakdown, increased glucose breakdown. It's all upping our metabolism, getting us ready for fight or flight. It's also secreted by those sympathetic nerves, right? So there's the capsule, this outer layer, the cortex with our 3 zones. You can see the zones are very different in structure, hence different in function, and then the medulla is very different as well. This is just a summary of all of the adrenal hormones. And you can pause the video here, go back and review this section. Let's talk about pancreatic islets. They're mostly retroperitoneal, so again, behind the peritoneal cavity, lies in a little loop in the inferior border of the stomach, proximal portion of the intestines, a little nestled in there like a little fish. It's pale, lumpy, and has an endocrine and exocrine function. As an exocrine, that's the majority of what it does. It is secreting the alkaline buffers and all of the enzymes that are needed for digestion. The cells that have the exocrine function are called the pancreatic acini cells, and all of those fluids flow through something called the pancreatic ducts into the digestive system. The endocrine pancreas is just a very, very, very small percentage, 1% of what the pancreas actually does. Small clusters of hormone-producing cells are called pancreatic islets. Think of the islet as like a little island. There's just small clusters of them, pancreatic islands of hormones, and they're secreting the insulin or glucagon. And there you see, again, it kind of looks like a little fish nestled in there. And the pancreatic islets have several different types of cells. One is alpha cell. Alpha cells secrete glucagon. Glucagon raises our blood glucose levels. It causes an increased rate of glycogen breakdown and glucose released by the liver, ultimately increasing our blood glucose levels and allowing our metabolism to increase. Beta cells are secreting insulin. Insulin is going to lower blood glucose. It's going to increase uptake and utilization by the cells. So suck the glucose out of the blood and stick it into the cells. It also increases glycogen production within the liver and skeletal muscles. There's also delta cells. So we had alpha cells with glucagon, beta cells with insulin. Now we have delta cells. Delta cells produce a peptide hormone that's almost identical to growth hormone inhibiting hormone. So this is going to suppress glucagon and insulin. It's going to slow food absorption, enzyme secretion in the intestinal tract. Slow things down. Again, think delta brainwaves, slow, sleepy. This is slowing things down. F cells are producing something called pancreatic polypeptide, PP. This is going to inhibit the contraction of the gallbladder, regulates pancreatic enzymes, and controls nutrient absorption. So here you see the islet, this little island among all of the acinar cells, or acini cells, which are all around. And again, in there are alpha, beta, delta, and F cells, all with their endocrine function. Let's talk about glucose homeostasis. Insulin and glucagon are those hormones that keep us in glucose homeostasis. As blood glucose levels rise, beta cells are going to secrete insulin. That's going to stimulate the release of, or the transport of glucose into cells. And then as blood glucose levels decline, then glucagon is going to be released, which is going to cause glucose to go back into the blood and be broken down. So it's this typical same feedback loop that we keep seeing over and over again. Blood glucose levels rise, beta cells secrete insulin, we have increased rate of glucose transport into the target cells, ATP generation, increased conversion from glucose to glycogen, increased amino acid reabsorption and protein synthesis, increased triglyceride synthesis in adipose tissue. So this is all depositing, saving, keeping it for later. Blood glucose levels are going to go down. But if you have a decline or blood glucose levels are too low, now everything's going to break down and start going back into the blood. Alpha cells secrete glucagon, breakdown of glycogen into glucose, breakdown of fat into fatty acids, synthesis and release of glucose from the liver. Overall, blood glucose levels are going to increase after all of that action. Here's the video from the masteringAMP.com website that you can check out. And here is 3 review questions that you can go back and review. Let's talk about the pineal gland. I like to say let's talk about it, sorry. I wish I was actually talking to you. It would be much more entertaining than sitting here in my office by myself, but that's all right. The pineal gland is part of the epithalamus. That small region in the diencephalon lies posterior to the third ventricle, contains neurons, neuroglia, secretory cells. The secretory cells are called pinealocytes. That's a fun word to say. Say it with me. Pinealocytes. Pinealocytes produce melatonin. Melatonin is basically a neurotransmitter. And there's special collaterals from the visual pathway that enter the pineal gland and affect the rate of melatonin production. Melatonin production is increased at night and decreased during the day. So in other words, as soon as it starts to get dark outside, melatonin starts accumulating, and that's when we start to get sleepy, naturally, right? Some people are resistant to that, but oops. This is just showing you the tissue of our pineal gland, lots of glial cells in there, and the pinealocytes. It's fun to say. All right, let's talk about what melatonin does. It can also inhibit reproductive function, so it may play a role in the timing of sexual maturation. Melatonin levels decline at puberty, and pineal tumors can stop melatonin production, causing premature puberty in young children. Your melatonin will also help protect you against free radical damage. It's very effective as an antioxidant. Free radicals like nitric oxide, hydrogen peroxide can form in active neural tissue, and so it helps stop those from damaging. Melatonin is also very important in setting circadian rhythms. Circadian rhythms are our day-night cycles, that day-night pattern that we have. Melatonin secretion increases in the darkness. It's suggested it's the primary cause of seasonal affective disorder, SAD. It's a condition that develops typically in the winter when people that live in the higher latitudes where there's very, very short days, or sometimes there's even days with no daylight at all. There's huge changes in mood, eating habits, sleeping patterns, and people can get very, very depressed. Functions of melatonin: reproductive functions, inhibits reproductive functions, protects against free radical damage, and sets those sleep-wake cycles. You can pause the video here, go back and review this section. Let's talk about some clinical things that can happen in our endocrine system. First, we have diabetes mellitus. It can be triggered by a genetic abnormality or a mutation. This is going to result in inadequate insulin production. It's going to result in the synthesis of abnormal insulin molecules or defective insulin receptors, because remember, you don't necessarily, well, you do need the endocrine tissue itself to make the hormone. You need the hormone and you need the receptor. You need all 3 of those things to work in order for your hormones to actually have an effect, right? So any step along that chain can cause an interruption. It's characterized by glucose concentrations being very, very high. It overwhelms the kidney, so you have what's called hyperglycemia, abnormally high blood glucose levels, glycosuria, which is glucose in the urine, and polyuria, which is excessive urine production. That's usually one of the first signs parents will see of their children. They say, man, they drink a lot and they pee a lot. They're just peeing all the time and they're losing weight, all these symptoms. Maybe they should get their blood sugar tested. So this is all type 1 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is inadequate insulin production from the beta cells. Individuals that have type 1 diabetes have to receive insulin daily. It can be through an injection, or it can be through some type of insulin pump or other device that's putting a continuous stream of insulin into the body. Only 5 to 10% of diabetes cases are type 1 diabetes. Typically, this is the juvenile diabetes. This is what is going to occur in children or young adults. Type 2 diabetes is the most common form. It's when you have normal amounts of insulin, your pancreas is working just fine, but your tissues are tired of all of the insulin bombarding them all of the time. It's called insulin resistance. It's associated with obesity. It can be treated with diet, exercise, and other medications that can alter glucose synthesis and release. So basically what happens in this case is you've been abusing your body for a very long time by eating lots and lots of sugar or high glucose foods, high carbohydrate foods, and your tissues have been receiving lots and lots of insulin over the years because that's the kind of diet you've always ate. And now your tissues are like, you know what? I don't want to hear it anymore. I don't care about your insulin. I'm not taking it anymore. And so the blood glucose levels stay high because your cells just aren't bringing in the glucose like they used to. And as long as you watch your sugars and go back to a normal diet and exercise, everything resets itself with type 2 diabetes. There are several problems, though, that are kind of secondary effects of diabetes. 2.8 million people in the U.S. have some form of diabetes. If it's untreated, there are lots and lots of things that can go wrong in your body. Without insulin, your cells can't get the glucose, so the tissues respond as if they're in chronic starvation mode and they're starting to break down lipids and proteins. This can cause changes in your blood vessels, your blood pH, all types of things. There's also diabetic retinopathy that can happen. This is when there's actual partial or complete blindness because the capillaries within your retina have been damaged because they're basically screaming for glucose that hasn't come in. So they're basically dying. There's also an increased risk of heart attack for people that have diabetes, 3 to 5 times more likely than any given category. People that have diabetes are much more likely. And this is because of degenerative blockages in the cardiac circulation. Again, those cells are not getting the glucose that they need for whatever reason, type 1 or type 2, but either way, the glucose isn't coming in, and therefore the cells are starting to die. There's also diabetic neuropathy. This is where the nerves neuropathy is one of them. That says nephropathy. I can never say it. It's kidney failure, basically. It's degenerative changes in your kidneys. Nephropathy. Nope, not going to say it. Here's neuropathy. This is an easier one to say. Diabetic neuropathy. This is abnormal blood flow to the neural tissues, so you get like numbness and tingling in your distal limbs, like in your fingertips and feet. Sometimes you even have to have your feet amputated or toes amputated. This is just looking at some of the causes or clinical problems that can be caused by diabetes. You can pause the video here, go back and answer these 3 questions. This section is kind of integrating our endocrine system with our other body systems. So there are 4 types of hormone interactions throughout our body. Cells have more than one type of hormone receptor, which we've discussed already. They can respond to multiple hormones at the same time, and they can receive instructions from 2 hormones at the same time. There's several different outcomes. It can be antagonistic or have opposing effects. Basically, the net results depends on the balance between the hormones. In general, the observed effects could be weaker than those that are produced when either hormone is unopposed. This would be like PTH and calcitonin. Whichever one is in higher quantities is the one that's going to win that battle. Insulin and glucagon, same thing. Hormone 1, hormone 2. Hormone 1 has increased cellular activity. Hormone 2 is going to have decreased cellular activity. So depending on which one is more abundant, that's what the cell is going to do. It could also be additive or have a synergistic effect. this would be where the net result is actually greater than those hormones acting by themselves. In some cases, this can happen. This would be like a glucose sparring action of growth hormone enhanced with the effects of glucocorticoids. So this is overall getting that metabolism up, getting those glucose reserves mobilized, and really starting to make some ATP, increasing cellular activity, that additive effect. There's also permissive effects, where one hormone is actually needed for the second hormone to have an effect. So this would be where epinephrine changes the rate of cellular energy consumption, but only in the presence of thyroid hormones. So epinephrine can be there all day, but if your thyroid hormone, or if your thyroid is not releasing thyroid hormones, or your thyroid hormones aren't circulating properly or whatever, those cellular energy processes are not going to occur as they need to be. So permissive effects. They can also be integrative. This is where hormones produce different but complementary effects. So this is very important in coordinating activities for several different functions in our body. This would be like calcitriol and PTH on calcium metabolism, where you have one hormone doing one thing, one hormone doing another thing, but overall, the effect is still for some common goal, where you still have calcitriol and PTH still acting together to increase blood calcium levels. This section here can be reviewed by answering these 3 questions. Oh, we're winding things down. Blood pressure, volume, and homeostatic regulation. Long-term regulation of blood pressure involves a few endocrine glands: the pituitary gland, the adrenal glands, and endocrine glands, including the heart and kidneys. So, overall, blood pressure and volume can be regulated through basic homeostatic regulatory mechanisms to decrease blood pressure in our body. Our endocrine cells in the walls of our heart, specifically the atrium, but we haven't talked about that yet, are going to respond to stretching. When they stretch, they're going to release natriuretic peptides. Natriuretic peptides are going to promote sodium and water loss at the kidneys. They're also going to inhibit the release of renin, ADH, and aldosterone. They're going to suppress your thirst and have an overall effect that is a reduction of blood volume and therefore a reduction of blood pressure. So your heart is stretched, and so natriuretic peptides are released, blood vessels dilate, thirst is suppressed, antagonistic hormones like aldosterone, ADH, etc. are inhibited, water and sodium loss from the kidneys is increased. So all of these things get our blood volume and blood pressure back down so that our heart can get back to normal. In the opposite, to increase blood pressure and blood volume, there are several endocrine cells in the kidney that play a role here. We have EPO being released, erythropoietin. This is going to increase red blood cell production in the bone marrow, ultimately increasing blood volume. And we also have renin. Renin is being released from the kidneys. It activates the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RAAS. This is going to lead to an increased fluid uptake and increased fluid retention. So normal blood pressure, declining blood pressure, decreased flow to the kidneys, etc. EPO is released, renin is released. EPO is going to cause increased red blood cell production. Renin is going to activate this RAAS system, causing ADH to be secreted, aldosterone to be secreted, and make you thirsty. Overall, increasing your blood volume, increasing your blood pressure, and getting you back to homeostasis. So, in order for your growth to be regulated, you have to have the cooperation of several endocrine organs. Hormones involved are regulated independently. There's a hormonal mixture that can alter metabolic operations, and the combined effects can produce unique growth patterns. Insulin, PTH, calcitriol, calcitonin are all needed in regulating growth. Insulin is allowing the passage of glucose across the cell membrane. PTH and calcitriol are playing a role in calcium absorption. Calcitonin is going to accelerate bone deposition. And bones obviously need to properly mineralize in order to grow. Thyroid hormones are required for nervous system and skeletal development, and reproductive hormones can affect osteoblast activities, as well as stimulate target cell growth and differentiation. Androgens in males, estrogens in females can affect different target tissues as well, producing differential growth, resulting in those sex-related differences like our skeletal proportions and secondary sex characteristics. So here you see all of these hormones: insulin, PTH, calcitriol, calcitonin, thyroid, reproductive, all needed to have normal projection of growth. Growth hormone is another one. That's kind of the obvious one, right? In children, it's not just about growing, it's supporting protein synthesis and cellular growth in the skeletal and muscular system. And in adults, it helps with our energy metabolism and storage. This is the summary here of growth hormone. You can pause the video here, go back and review this little section. Finally, stress, the stress response. Any stress or emotional condition that threatens homeostasis is called stress. It can be mediated by specific adjustments, like shivering in a response to dropping blood pressure or blood temperature, or exposure to a wide variety of stress-causing factors can lead to hormonal as well as physiological responses. This is going to activate our general adaptation syndrome or stress response. So the first phase is called the alarm phase. This is the immediate sympathetic response to stress. Oh man, I can't believe I didn't get that paper done or whatever, right? That, right? Epinephrine is your dominant hormone at that spot, at that time. Two main responses. Energy reserves are mobilized, mainly glucose here, and this is your general fight or flight, increased respiration, increased heart rate, blood pressure, pupils dilate, all of that. So, alarm phase. Then you go into the resistance phase. This is after a few hours of stress. So, glucocorticoids are dominant here. Epinephrine, growth hormone, thyroid hormones are also involved. Continued very high energy demands. Glycogen is almost exhausted at this point. Your body shifts to using lipids and amino acids. And the overall effect is utilizing the body's energy reserves while reserving glucose for your neural tissue. Your brain can really only use glucose to metabolize. So resistance phase is shifting the metabolism away from the glucose and using other things instead. Finally, we get to the exhaustion phase. This is when the energy reserves cannot be maintained. This could be a period of weeks or months. Homeostatic regulation breaks down. Organ systems begin to fail. Mineral electrolyte balances contribute to malfunction. This is when you get to the point where you're not thinking straight anymore. This is when you get to the point where you're making mistakes, where you can't see or think clearly. I just said that. Maybe I'm in the exhaustion phase. I probably am. This is where your body is really starting to scream for help, and you need to be recognizing those signs. Maybe you're losing hair. Maybe you're having heartburn or chest pains or something like that at this point of the stress response. So typically the exhaustion phase is very, very extreme, and it's not something that is your typical, I have 3 exams this week. The physiological response in the exhaustion phase is very dramatic in your body. Your body system will be shutting down. You will have health problems at this stage of the game. The majority of you that think you're stressed, including myself right now, and most of the times during the semester, as I try to balance everything, I feel like I'm in this exhaustion phase, but really, physiologically, I'm not. I'm still eating, I'm still sleeping, I'm still maintaining my normal levels of activity. I'm not in the exhaustion phase. Shutting down at night and et cetera is reestablishing your homeostasis. So here are some questions to review from this section. Finally, some endocrine disorders. These are abnormalities at various levels that can cause issues with our endocrine disorders. Like I said, the abnormality can happen with the gland, within the mechanism, or within the target tissue. So any step along that way can have an effect on your endocrine system. The effects are usually caused by underproduction instead of an overproduction, and disorders of hyposecretion are most common. So most common forms of hyposecretion are metabolic factors. There's some type of deficiency in a key substance that's needed to synthesize a hormone. Like hypothyroidism can be caused by inadequate iodine intake in the diet. Like I was mentioning, our salt is now iodized to help with our thyroid hormone production. In decades past, hypothyroidism was very rampant, and then nutritionists discovered, well, hey, we can just iodize the salt. Most people put salt in their foods, and salt goes in, into everything, and problem solved. So there's also physical damage that could cause hyposecretion, interruption to normal circulatory pathway, or a damage to a specific endocrine tissue. You can also have congenital disorders, like maybe the gland is just too small, or maybe the required enzymes are abnormal, or the receptors are insensitive, or the glands lack the receptors. So common causes: metabolic, physical, or congenital. Overall causes of endocrine abnormalities can also be caused by the presence of abnormal receptors, like the glands and regulatory mechanisms are normal, but the peripheral cells are unable to respond to the circulating hormone. This would be that type 2 diabetes, where the peripheral cells just do not respond to insulin. Acromegaly is a result from the overproduction of growth hormone after the epiphyseal plates have fused, so there's no increase in height, but the bone shape changes. The cartilaginous areas of the skeleton enlarge, and the signs include a very enlarged lower jaw, very broad facial features. The bones don't get longer, they just get thicker. There's goiter, which is a thyroid disorder. This is an enlarged thyroid. This is associated with the hyposecretion of thyroid hormone, and this is, again, related to that iodine deficiency. Infantile hypothyroidism is a congenital disorder where the thyroid hormone is not being produced and is characterized by a mental disability, like a puffy face, thick tongue, etc. There's a goiter. Infantile hypothyroidism. Addison's disease is an adrenal gland disorder. This is caused by the hyposecretion of corticosteroids, especially glucocorticoids. It causes pigment changes in the skin because it's going to affect your melanocyte activity. There's also Cushing's disease, which is caused by hypersecretion of glucocorticoids. The lipid reserves are mobilized. The adipose tissue accumulates in the cheeks and at the base of the neck. Addison's disease, Cushing's disease. And overall review of endocrine disorders related to all of the hormones. And we are done with chapter 16. So let me know what questions you have, and hopefully I can help you through this very last chapter of our semester. And I hope you have an awesome day.